Chapter 1. A Cold War Begins. Don't forget to hit like. Your support helps us create more inspiring content like this. The year was 1947. The world had just come out of the Second World War. Cities were in ruins. Families had been torn apart. Nations wanted peace. But peace did not come. Two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were now rivals. They had once been allies in the war, but now they did not trust each other. Their ideas were very different. The United States believed in freedom and democracy. The Soviet Union believed in communism and strict control. These two powers wanted to shape the future of the world, and neither wanted to lose. This rivalry was called the Cold War. It was not a war with soldiers and guns. It was a war of technology, science, and power. Each side wanted to prove it was the strongest. Each side wanted to be first. But how would they decide who was the best? In the late 1940s and 1950s, both nations began building powerful weapons. They made bombs so strong they could destroy entire cities. The world lived in fear of these weapons. People wondered, will there be another war? Will we survive? But the war never came. Instead, the United States and the Soviet Union found a new battlefield: space. The idea of going to space was exciting. People had always dreamed about the stars. For thousands of years, they had looked up at the night sky and wondered, what is out there? Stories were told about gods and monsters in the heavens. Scientists studied the planets and the moon. But space seemed far away. It seemed impossible to reach. That changed in the 20th century. Rockets were invented. These powerful machines could fly higher and faster than ever before. At first, they were used as weapons in war. But some scientists had bigger dreams. They believed rockets could take us to space. These dreams became a race to explore the unknown. The Soviet Union wanted to win this race. They believed that space exploration would show their strength to the world. They also believed it would prove that communism was better than democracy. They started working on secret projects. Scientists and engineers worked day and night. Their goal was to build a rocket that could reach space. The United States was also dreaming of space. They did not want the Soviet Union to win. The U.S. government poured money into science and technology. Schools began teaching more math and science. They told young people, you can help us win this race. But the Soviets had a head start. They were very determined. Their leader, Nikita Khrushchev, wanted to show the world that the Soviet Union was the best. He ordered scientists to work harder and faster. Every day, engineers tested new ideas. Sometimes the rockets exploded. Sometimes they failed to fly. But they did not give up. They wanted to make history. Then, on October 4th, 1957, something amazing happened. The Soviet Union launched a small satellite into space. It was called Sputnik. It was shiny and round, about the size of a beach ball. Sputnik did not do much. It just beeped as it traveled around the Earth. But that sound changed everything. When people in America heard about Sputnik, they were shocked. How had the Soviet Union done this first? The Americans felt scared and embarrassed. They thought they were the most advanced nation in the world. But now, the Soviets were leading the space race. People looked up at the sky and imagined Sputnik flying above them. It was both thrilling and terrifying. President Dwight D. Eisenhower spoke to the nation. He told them not to be afraid. But many people were afraid. They worried that the Soviets could use rockets to attack the United States. Schools held drills where children hid under their desks. Politicians demanded action. They said, "We cannot let the Soviets win." The United States began to work harder. Scientists met in secret labs. Engineers tested rocket after rocket. Sometimes the rockets exploded. Sometimes they crashed. But slowly, they improved. The government created a new organization called NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA's mission was clear. America would go to space. Meanwhile, the Soviets celebrated. They had done what no one else had. Sputnik circled the Earth, beeping proudly. People in the Soviet Union felt strong. They felt proud of their scientists. Khrushchev boasted, "We are first in space." But the Americans were not ready to give up. They planned their own satellite. They named it Explorer 1. On January 31st, 1958, Explorer 1 was launched into space. It was smaller than Sputnik, but it carried important instruments. It sent back data about radiation in space. America had entered the race. The space race was more than just rockets and satellites. It was about dreams. It was about proving what humans could do. It was also about fear. Each nation wanted to be stronger, faster, and smarter than the other. People wondered, what will happen next? Who will win? For now, the Soviet Union was ahead, but the United States was catching up. Both nations knew the stakes were high. The next steps would take them further than anyone had ever gone before. The race to explore space had truly begun. What secrets would they find? What dangers would they face? Only time would tell. Chapter 2. The beeping start of history. The night sky was clear on October 4th, 1957. People all over the world looked up. Most saw only stars. But something new was there. Something small, bright, and man-made. It was Sputnik, the first satellite. Sputnik was built by the Soviet Union. It was about the size of a beach ball. It had 4 long antennas, like tiny metal legs. It moved quickly, circling the Earth. As it flew, it sent out a steady sound. Beep, beep, beep. That simple sound would change the world. When people heard about Sputnik, they were amazed. No one had ever put anything into space before. It was a moment of history. Newspapers called it the dawn of the space age. But not everyone felt excited. Some felt scared. In the Soviet Union, people celebrated. They cheered for their scientists. They called Sputnik proof that communism was strong. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was proud. He told the world, "We are first in space." His words were bold. His country was winning the space race. for now. But in the United States, the reaction was very different. Many Americans were shocked. They asked, "How could the Soviets do this before us? What does it mean?" Sputnik was not just a satellite. It was a sign that the Soviets were ahead in technology. Some feared that the same rockets that launched Sputnik could carry bombs. Fear spread quickly. In schools, children practiced hiding under desks. This was called a duck and cover drill. The drills were meant to protect them if bombs fell. But the fear was bigger than that. Sputnik made people feel small and powerless. The satellite was high above them, out of reach. It was a reminder that the Cold War was not just on Earth anymore. It had reached space. President Dwight D. Eisenhower tried to calm the nation. He spoke on television. He said that America was still strong, but many people were not convinced. They wanted answers. They wanted action. Scientists in the United States worked day and night. They wanted to catch up. They knew they had to build their own satellite, and fast, but their first attempt ended in disaster. On December 6, 1957, they launched a rocket carrying a satellite called Vanguard. The world watched. The rocket rose into the air. Then it exploded. The newspapers called it Flopnik. People laughed, but the failure was no joke. America's pride was hurt. The Soviets were winning, and the Americans felt embarrassed. They had to try again. Sputnik continued to orbit the Earth. It circled the planet once every 96 minutes. It traveled so fast that it could cross the sky in just a few minutes. People could even see it. They stood outside at night, searching for the tiny, moving dot of light. When they saw it, they felt a mix of wonder and fear. The scientists behind Sputnik became heroes in the Soviet Union. One of them was Sergei Korolev. He was the chief designer of the Soviet space program. His work was top secret. Few people even knew his name at the time. But Korolev was a genius. He dreamed of exploring space. Sputnik was his first big success. He believed it was just the beginning. Sputnik's success inspired other projects. Less than a month after its launch, the Soviets sent another satellite into space. It was called Sputnik 2. This time, it carried a passenger, a dog named Laika. She was the first living creature to orbit the Earth. Laika's flight was a triumph for science, but it also raised questions about ethics. The little dog did not survive her mission. People around the world wondered if space exploration was worth such a cost. Meanwhile, the United States worked harder than ever. They launched their next satellite, called Explorer 1, on January 31st, 1958. This time, the rocket worked. Explorer 1 carried instruments that measured radiation in space. It was a small victory for America, but it showed that the space race was far from over. Sputnik did more than start the space race. It also inspired a new focus on education. In the United States, schools began teaching more science and math. The government created new programs to train engineers. People realized that the future would belong to those who could dream big and solve complex problems. Sputnik had lit a spark. Around the world, people talked about space. Writers imagined life on other planets. Children dreamed of becoming astronauts. Artists painted pictures of rockets and stars. The excitement was everywhere. Space was no longer just a mystery. It was a challenge and an opportunity. The space race was about more than technology. It was about power, pride, and dreams. For the Soviets, Sputnik was a symbol of their strength. For the Americans, it was a wake-up call. For the world, it was a glimpse of the future. The sound of beep, beep, beep echoed in hearts and minds. It reminded people that they were part of something bigger, something beyond the Earth. Sputnik's mission ended after 21 days. Its batteries ran out, and it stopped beeping. But its impact never faded. The tiny satellite had changed history. It had opened the door to space, and it had started a race that would take humans to places they had never imagined. What would come next? Could humans reach the moon? Could they live in space? The questions were endless. The journey had just begun. Chapter 3: A Brave Journey into the Unknown. On April 12, 1961, the world changed forever. A young Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin sat inside a small spacecraft. The spacecraft was called Vostok 1. It was tiny, just big enough for one person. It stood on top of a tall rocket, ready to launch into space. The morning was cold and quiet. Yuri's heart was racing. He was 27 years old, and he was about to become the first human in space. No one had ever done this before. Everyone knew it was dangerous. Many rockets had exploded during tests. Yuri's life depended on everything going perfectly. As Yuri sat waiting, he smiled. He was a brave man. He had trained hard for this day. But he also knew the risks. He had said goodbye to his family just in case he didn't return. He looked at the controls in front of him. Soon, he would see the Earth from space. "Ready?" Yuri said calmly. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The ground shook as the engines roared to life. Fire and smoke filled the air. The rocket lifted off, carrying Yuri into the sky. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice crackled over the radio. "We have liftoff!" People cheered. The world was watching. Everyone held their breath as Vostok 1 climbed higher and higher. Would it make it? Would Yuri survive? Inside the spacecraft, Yuri felt the incredible force of the launch. It pushed him back into his seat. He stared out of the small window. The blue sky turned darker and darker. Then, suddenly, it was black. The stars appeared. They were bright and beautiful. Yuri was in space. "It's amazing," Yuri said over the radio. His voice was full of wonder. Below him, the Earth looked small and fragile. He saw rivers, mountains, and clouds. The planet was wrapped in a thin blue line, the atmosphere. "I see Earth, and it is beautiful," he said. For 108 minutes, Yuri orbited the Earth. He was weightless, floating inside Vostok 1. It felt strange, but exciting. He looked out the window and thought about the people watching below. He knew he was making history. He was the first human to leave the planet. But Yuri's mission was not over. Getting back to Earth was just as dangerous as going up. The spacecraft had to re-enter the atmosphere. This was the most dangerous part of the journey. If the angle was wrong, Vostok 1 could burn up like a shooting star. Yuri felt the spacecraft shake as it re-entered. The heat shield glowed red-hot, protecting him from the fiery descent. Flames surrounded the capsule. Yuri stayed calm. He had trained for this moment. The shaking stopped, and the parachutes deployed. Vostok 1 slowed down as it approached the ground. Finally, the capsule landed in a field. Yuri ejected from the spacecraft and parachuted to the ground. A farmer and her daughter saw him land. They were shocked. He was wearing an orange spacesuit and a white helmet. At first, they were afraid. Yuri smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'm one of us. I'm a Soviet." The news of Yuri's journey spread quickly. The world was amazed. People couldn't believe that a human had been to space and returned safely. Yuri became a hero overnight. He visited countries around the world, sharing his story. Everywhere he went, crowds cheered for him. In the Soviet Union, Yuri was a symbol of hope and pride. The government celebrated his success as proof of their power. Nikita Khrushchev called Yuri the man who opened the road to the stars. The Soviets were leading the space race once again. But Yuri's journey also inspired people outside the Soviet Union. In the United States, President John F. Kennedy congratulated Yuri and the Soviet scientists, but he also made a promise: America would not fall behind. He announced a bold goal: to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely. The space race was far from over. Yuri's bravery touched people all over the world. He was not just a Soviet hero. He was a hero for all humanity. His journey showed that humans could explore beyond the Earth. It gave people hope that one day they too might reach the stars. Yuri remained humble despite his fame. He said, "I am just a simple man who flew into space." But his courage and kindness made him unforgettable. He reminded people that the space race was not just about politics. It was about human dreams and the desire to explore the unknown. Sadly, Yuri's life was cut short. He died in a plane crash in 1968. He was only 34 years old. The world mourned his loss, but his legacy lived on. Streets, schools, and even craters on the moon were named after him. Every year, on April 12th, people celebrate Yuri's achievement on Yuri's Night. It is a day to remember the first human in space and to dream about the future. Yuri Gagarin's journey was the start of a new era. He showed that the impossible could become possible. He dared to go where no one had gone before, and he inspired millions to look up at the stars and wonder, what's next? Chapter 4: America Fights Back. In the spring of 1961, America was shaken. The Soviet Union had sent Yuri Gagarin into space. He was the first human to orbit the Earth. The news spread quickly, and the world celebrated. But in the United States, there was worry. The Soviets were ahead in the space race. President John F. Kennedy knew that something had to be done. He believed the United States could not fall behind. On May 25, 1961, he spoke to Congress. His words would inspire a generation. "We choose to go to the moon," he said, "not because it is easy, but because it is hard." The challenge was set. America would aim higher than ever before. They would send astronauts to the moon and bring them back safely. The task was enormous. Landing on the moon required new technologies, new ideas, and incredible teamwork. NASA, the U.S. space agency, became the center of this effort. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers were called to action. They knew the mission was difficult, but they were determined. The first step was the Mercury program. It was designed to send Americans into space. In 1961, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American to travel into space. His flight lasted only 15 minutes, but it was a start. A few months later, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. These missions proved that America could compete. But there was still much to do. The next program, called Gemini, aimed to test spacewalking and docking 2 spacecraft in orbit. These skills were essential for a moon mission. In 1965, astronaut Ed White floated outside a spacecraft. He was the first American to perform a spacewalk. As he drifted in the blackness of space, connected by a thin cord, he said, "This is the greatest experience of my life." The Gemini program was full of challenges. Rockets exploded. Equipment failed. But each mission taught valuable lessons. NASA was learning how to work in space and how to survive. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. Meanwhile, work began on the Apollo program. This was the program that would take astronauts to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft was much larger and more complex than anything before it. It required a powerful rocket to lift it into space. The Saturn V rocket, designed by Wernher von Braun and his team, was the answer. It was the most powerful rocket ever built. The pressure was intense. The world was watching. The Soviet Union had its own plans for the moon. NASA felt the weight of every decision. Failure was not an option, but failure did come. In January 1967, tragedy struck. During a test for Apollo 1, a fire broke out inside the spacecraft. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, lost their lives. The nation was heartbroken. NASA stopped to investigate what had gone wrong. They found flaws in the design and made changes to ensure safety. The Apollo program continued, but the memory of the lost astronauts stayed with everyone. Their sacrifice became a reminder of the risks and the importance of the mission. After months of work, the Apollo program was ready for its first major test. In 1968, Apollo 7 launched into Earth's orbit. The crew tested the new spacecraft and systems. The mission was a success. Then in December 1968, Apollo 8 made history. For the first time, humans left Earth's orbit and traveled to the moon. The astronauts of Apollo 8 did not land on the moon. Their mission was to circle it and return safely. As they orbited, they saw the far side of the moon, a sight no one had ever seen before. They also saw the Earth, small and blue, rising above the moon's surface. This image, called Earthrise, became famous. It reminded people of how beautiful and fragile our planet is. With each mission, NASA came closer to its goal. The engineers worked day and night. The astronauts trained in mock-ups of the lunar surface. They practiced landing, walking, and taking off from the moon. Every detail had to be perfect. The race to the moon was intense. The Soviet Union was also making progress. They built a giant rocket, the N-1, to take cosmonauts to the moon. But the N-1 failed in tests. The Soviets were falling behind. The Americans were now leading the space race. In July 1969, NASA prepared for the most important mission of all, Apollo 11. The world watched as 3 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, prepared for their historic journey. It was almost time to take the biggest leap in human history. The road to Apollo 11 was long and filled with challenges, but the people of NASA never gave up. They believed in the mission. They believed in each other, and they believed in the dream of reaching the moon. As President Kennedy had said years earlier, they chose to go to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard. They were ready to make the dream a reality. Chapter 5. The Mercury 7. In 1959, America began a bold new project. It was called Project Mercury. The goal was clear but difficult: to send an American into space and bring them back safely. It was a dangerous mission. The world was watching. Could America succeed? To make this dream a reality, NASA needed heroes. They needed people who were smart, brave, and strong. They found 7. These 7 men would become known as the Mercury 7. They were the first astronauts of the United States. The Mercury 7 were all test pilots. They were used to flying fast and taking risks. They had trained to control powerful jets and survive emergencies. But space was different. It was unknown. It was deadly. To prepare for this mission, they had to train harder than ever before. The astronauts trained in many ways. They sat in spinning machines called centrifuges. These machines made them feel the forces of a rocket launch. It was like being pressed into a wall. It made them dizzy and tired. But they had to endure it. They also practiced in a simulator. The simulator was a model of the Mercury spacecraft. It had controls and switches like the real thing. The astronauts learned how to operate the spacecraft in every situation. If something went wrong, they had to know how to fix it. The Mercury spacecraft was very small. It was just big enough for one person. The astronaut could not stand or move around. They had to sit in a chair and control everything from there. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but it was the only way to go to space. The astronauts also had to pass medical tests. Doctors checked their hearts, lungs, and muscles. They had to be in perfect health. Space was tough on the body. The astronauts had to be ready for anything. The Mercury 7 were more than just astronauts. They were symbols of hope. They represented America's fight in the space race. People looked up to them. They became famous. Their pictures were in newspapers and magazines. Children wanted to be like them. They were called heroes. One of these heroes was Alan Shepard. He was chosen to be the first American to go to space. It was a dangerous mission. No American had ever done this before. If something went wrong, Alan could die. But he was ready. He believed in the mission. The day of Alan's flight came on May 5th, 1961. The rocket stood tall on the launch pad. It was called the Redstone rocket. At the top was the Mercury spacecraft, named Freedom 7. Alan climbed inside. He was calm, but everyone else was nervous. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The engines roared to life. Flames shot out from the rocket. The ground shook. Then, the rocket lifted off. It rose into the sky, carrying Alan Shepard into history. The flight was short. It lasted only 15 minutes. Alan did not orbit the Earth. He flew up, reached space, and came back down. But it was enough. It was proof that America could send a person to space. When Alan landed in the ocean, rescue teams were waiting. He smiled as they opened the hatch. "It's a great day," he said. The world cheered. America had taken a big step forward in the space race. The Mercury 7 had proven themselves. The Soviets were still ahead, but the Americans were catching up. After Alan's flight, NASA continued with the Mercury program. They sent more astronauts into space. John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth in 1962. His flight lasted nearly 5 hours. People across the country watched on television. When John landed safely, the nation celebrated. The Mercury astronauts faced many dangers. Rockets sometimes failed. Equipment didn't always work. But they stayed brave. They trusted their training. They knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. The Mercury program also inspired others. Young people wanted to study science and engineering. Schools began teaching more about space. The program showed that anything was possible if you worked hard and believed in your dreams. The Mercury 7 were pioneers. They opened the door to the stars. They proved that humans could explore space. Their courage and determination set the stage for the missions that would follow. But their journey was only the beginning. Bigger challenges lay ahead. The dream of reaching the moon was still waiting, and America was ready to chase it. Before we begin Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Stars. The space race was not just a battle of rockets, it was also a battle of secrets. Both the United States and the Soviet Union wanted to win. They worked in secret labs. They built new machines. They tested ideas no one had ever tried before. Spies and secrecy played a big role in this race to the stars. The Soviets were proud of their success. They had sent Yuri Gagarin, the first man, into space. But they wanted more. They wanted to show the world that they were the leaders in space exploration. In 1963, they made history again. This time, they sent the first woman into space. Her name was Valentina Tereshkova. She was not a pilot or a scientist. She was a factory worker and a parachutist. She had grown up in a small village and worked hard all her life. But she was strong and brave. The Soviets believed she could handle the dangers of space. On June 16, 1963, Valentina climbed into the spacecraft Vostok 6. Her call sign was Chaika, which means seagull in Russian. The rocket launched into the sky, leaving a trail of fire and smoke. Valentina's heart raced as she felt the power of the engines. Moments later, she was in space. She looked out the window and saw the Earth far below. "I see the horizon," she said. "It's beautiful." Valentina spent almost 3 days in space. She orbited the Earth 48 times. She felt weightless and floated inside the spacecraft. But the mission was not easy. The spacecraft was cramped, and the conditions were harsh. Valentina became tired and sick. Still, she stayed focused. She knew she was making history. When Valentina returned to Earth, she was celebrated as a hero. She became a symbol of Soviet strength and equality. The Soviets showed the world that women could be astronauts too. Valentina's courage inspired millions, especially young girls, to dream big. Meanwhile, the Americans were working just as hard. They knew they had to catch up. They needed powerful rockets to reach the moon. For this, they turned to a German scientist named Wernher von Braun. He was an expert in rocket design and had worked on missiles during World War II. Now, he was using his skills for space exploration. Von Braun led a team of scientists and engineers at NASA. They worked in Huntsville, Alabama, designing the mighty Saturn V rocket. This rocket was the key to the Apollo program. It had to be powerful enough to carry astronauts and a spacecraft all the way to the moon. It also had to be safe and reliable. The Saturn V was an engineering marvel. It was taller than the Statue of Liberty and weighed over 6 million pounds. When it launched, its engines produced enough power to light up a small city. The rocket went through many tests. Sometimes it failed. But each failure taught the team something new. Slowly, they perfected the design. While the engineers built rockets, the government gathered information. Spies worked in secret, trying to learn about Soviet plans. The Soviets also had spies in the United States. Both sides wanted to know what the other was doing. This secrecy added pressure to the space race. Every mission had to be perfect. A single mistake could mean falling behind, or worse. The Americans faced another challenge. They needed to keep the public excited about space exploration. President John F. Kennedy had promised to put a man on the moon. But some people thought it was too expensive. Others thought it was too dangerous. NASA had to prove that the mission was worth it. Television became an important tool. The Mercury and Gemini missions were broadcast live. People watched rockets launch and astronauts floating in space. They felt proud of their country. They believed in the dream of reaching the moon. In the Soviet Union, the government controlled the news. They only shared information about successful missions. Failures were kept secret. This made it hard to know how far ahead or behind the Soviets really were. The mystery added tension to the space race. By the mid-1960s, both nations had achieved great things. The Soviets had sent the first man and woman into space. The Americans had completed the Gemini program, testing spacewalking and docking. Each side pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But the stakes were getting higher. The goal was no longer just to reach space. The goal was the moon. The Soviets and the Americans worked harder than ever. Each success brought pride and pressure to do more. In 1965, the Soviets made another bold move. Alexei Leonov became the first person to walk in space. He floated outside his spacecraft, connected by a tether. The vastness of space surrounded him. It was both beautiful and terrifying. Leonov's spacewalk lasted only 12 minutes, but it proved that humans could survive outside their spacecraft. The Americans answered with the Gemini missions. Astronauts Ed White and Buzz Aldrin performed spacewalks, staying outside their spacecraft for longer periods. They practiced moving and using tools in zero gravity. These skills would be vital for landing on the moon. The space race was not just about politics or power. It was about pushing the limits of human knowledge. Scientists studied the stars, planets, and space itself. They developed new technologies, from advanced computers to lightweight materials. These discoveries benefited everyone, not just the astronauts. As the 1960s continued, the competition grew more intense. Both sides wanted to be the first to land on the moon. The Soviets worked on a massive rocket called the N-1. The Americans focused on the Apollo program and the Saturn V rocket. The world watched and waited. Who would reach the moon first? The answer was not yet clear. But one thing was certain. The space race was changing the world. It was a time of secrets, science, and incredible courage. Chapter 7. Gemini, Two Together. Before astronauts could land on the moon, they needed to master important skills. They needed to learn how to work in space for long periods. They had to practice joining two spacecraft together, a process called docking. They also needed to test spacewalking, leaving the spacecraft and floating outside. This was the purpose of NASA's Gemini program. It was named after the twins in Greek mythology because each Gemini mission carried two astronauts. These missions were a bridge between the earlier Mercury flights and the upcoming Apollo moon landings. They would teach astronauts how to live and work in space. The Gemini spacecraft was larger than Mercury. It could hold two astronauts instead of one. It had better systems for life support and navigation. The spacecraft was launched into space by a powerful Titan II rocket. Each mission pushed the boundaries of what humans could do. In June 1965, something magical happened. On the Gemini 4 mission, astronaut Ed White became the first American to perform a spacewalk. His partner, Jim McDivitt, stayed inside the spacecraft, keeping everything under control. Ed White's heart raced as the time for his spacewalk came. He opened the hatch and carefully stepped outside. He was connected to the spacecraft by a thin cord called a tether. It was his lifeline. If the tether broke, he would drift away into the endless darkness of space. As Ed floated outside, he saw the Earth below. It was breathtaking. He could see blue oceans, white clouds, and green land. The thin atmosphere wrapped around the planet like a fragile shell. He felt awe and wonder. "The view is beautiful," he said. His voice was filled with excitement. The spacewalk lasted 23 minutes. Ed used a small jet gun to move around. It sprayed compressed gas, allowing him to float in different directions. He was weightless, like a bird in the sky. The experience was unforgettable. But the spacewalk was also dangerous. The tether kept Ed connected to the spacecraft, but it was not easy to control his movements. He had to be careful not to get tangled. Inside the spacecraft, Jim watched closely, ready to help if something went wrong. When it was time to return, Ed didn't want to go back inside. "I'm coming back in, and it's the saddest moment of my life," he joked. The world laughed, but they also understood. Floating in space was a dream come true for Ed, but safety came first. Gemini 4 was just the beginning. Over the next few years, the Gemini program achieved incredible things. Astronauts stayed in space for days, testing how their bodies reacted to weightlessness. They learned how to eat, sleep, and work in zero gravity. Every mission taught them something new. One of the most important skills tested during Gemini was docking. This meant joining two spacecraft together while they orbited the Earth. Docking was critical for the Apollo missions. The lunar module would have to connect with the command module to bring astronauts back from the moon. Docking was not easy. The spacecraft moved very fast, traveling thousands of miles per hour. The astronauts had to be precise. Even a small mistake could cause a crash. But with practice, they learned how to do it. In March 1966, Gemini 8 completed the first successful docking in space. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and David Scott joined their spacecraft with an unmanned vehicle called the Agena target. It was a huge achievement. But the mission almost ended in disaster. After docking, the spacecraft began to spin out of control. A thruster was stuck open, causing the spacecraft to rotate faster and faster. Neil Armstrong stayed calm. He used the re-entry thrusters to stop the spin. His quick thinking saved the mission and their lives. It showed the world the bravery and skill of the astronauts. The Gemini program was full of challenges. Rockets exploded during tests. Equipment failed. The astronauts faced risks on every mission. But they never gave up. They knew their work was paving the way for the moon landing. Each mission brought them closer to that goal. The public watched the Gemini missions with excitement. Television showed live broadcasts of launches and spacewalks. People marveled at the courage of the astronauts. Children dreamed of becoming space explorers. The Gemini program inspired a generation. For the astronauts, the work was hard but rewarding. They spent months training for each mission. They practiced in simulators, learning how to handle emergencies. They worked closely with engineers to understand the spacecraft. They knew their lives depended on being prepared. By the end of the Gemini program, NASA had achieved what it set out to do. Astronauts had spent up to 14 days in space, proving that humans could survive long missions. They had mastered docking, spacewalking, and other critical skills. The lessons from Gemini were essential for the Apollo program. Gemini was a time of learning and discovery. It showed that humans could push beyond their limits. It was not just about technology. It was about teamwork, courage, and determination. As the Gemini program ended, the world turned its attention to the next challenge, the moon. The skills learned during Gemini would make the Apollo missions possible. The astronauts were ready. The engineers were ready. The dream of reaching the moon was closer than ever. Chapter 8. A Tragic Fire. In January 1967, NASA was preparing for its next big step. The Apollo program was designed to take astronauts to the moon. The first mission, Apollo 1, was a test flight. It would not leave Earth's orbit, but it was an important step toward the moon. 3 astronauts were chosen for the mission. Gus Grissom was the commander. He was a veteran of both the Mercury and Gemini programs. Ed White was the first American to walk in space. Roger Chaffee was a skilled pilot and the youngest member of the crew. They were proud to be part of the Apollo program. The spacecraft for Apollo 1 was new. It was larger and more complex than any before it. Engineers had worked hard to design it, but there were problems. Wires were exposed, equipment was not finished. The astronauts noticed these issues and voiced their concerns. They wanted to be sure it was safe. On January 27, 1967, the crew was scheduled to perform a test. It was called a plugs-out test. The spacecraft would be sealed, and the crew would sit inside, just as they would during a real launch. The test was not dangerous, or so everyone thought. That afternoon, Gus, Ed, and Roger climbed into the spacecraft. They were strapped into their seats. The hatch was closed. The atmosphere inside the spacecraft was filled with pure oxygen. This made it easier to breathe, but it was also very dangerous. Oxygen burns easily, even with the smallest spark. The test began. The astronauts went through their checklist, checking systems and controls. But there were problems. Communication with the ground crew was difficult. Static filled the radio, making it hard to hear. Then, at 6:31 p.m., it happened. A spark ignited a fire inside the spacecraft. In seconds, the flames spread. The astronauts tried to open the hatch, but it was locked tight. The pressure inside the spacecraft made it even harder to escape. Smoke filled the air. the crew had no way out. The fire lasted less than a minute. By the time the ground crew managed to open the hatch, it was too late. Gus, Ed, and Roger had died. The news spread quickly. America was in shock. The Apollo program had lost its first crew before it had even begun. The nation mourned their loss. Gus Grissom was a national hero. He had been one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. Ed White was known for his bravery during his spacewalk. Roger Chaffee was a rising star, full of promise. Their deaths were a painful reminder of the dangers of space exploration. NASA faced hard questions. How could this happen? What went wrong? An investigation began immediately. Engineers examined every piece of the spacecraft. They found many problems. The spacecraft's wiring was poorly designed. The materials used inside were flammable. The oxygen-rich atmosphere made the fire spread quickly. The Apollo program was put on hold. NASA knew it had to fix these problems before continuing. The spacecraft was redesigned. Flammable materials were replaced. The hatch was changed so it could be opened quickly in an emergency. Safety became the top priority. The loss of the Apollo 1 crew was a turning point. It reminded everyone how dangerous space exploration could be. Rockets were powerful, but they could fail. Spacecraft were advanced, but they were not perfect. The lives of astronauts depended on every detail being right. Despite the tragedy, the Apollo program continued. The astronauts' sacrifice inspired their colleagues to work harder. They knew Gus, Ed, and Roger would have wanted them to keep going. They would honor their memory by reaching the moon. The Apollo 1 fire also taught the world an important lesson. Exploration is not easy. It comes with risks. But those risks can lead to great achievements. The fire showed that mistakes could be deadly, but it also showed that they could be corrected. NASA would learn from this tragedy and move forward. The families of the astronauts were heartbroken. They had supported their loved ones in their dream of going to space. Now they had to face the loss. But they also knew the importance of the mission. Gus's wife, Betty Grissom, said, "If my husband had to die for this program, he died for something he believed in." The fire shook NASA to its core. Engineers, scientists, and astronauts worked together to rebuild the Apollo program. They wanted to ensure that no more lives were lost. Every system was tested. Every problem was addressed. The next mission had to succeed. By 1968, the Apollo program was ready to resume. Apollo 7 was the first successful mission after the fire. It carried a crew into Earth's orbit, testing the new spacecraft. The mission was a success, proving that NASA had learned from its mistakes. The memory of Apollo 1 stayed with everyone at NASA. Gus, Ed, and Roger were honored in many ways. Their names were inscribed on memorials. Craters on the moon were named after them. Each Apollo mission carried a patch to remember them. Their sacrifice was not in vain. It made future missions safer. It reminded the world that space exploration required courage, determination, and teamwork. The Apollo 1 crew may not have reached the stars, but their legacy helped others get there. As NASA prepared for the ultimate goal, landing on the moon, the lessons of Apollo 1 were always present. Every astronaut who climbed into a spacecraft knew the risks. They also knew they were following in the footsteps of heroes. The tragedy of Apollo 1 was a dark moment in the space race, but it also showed the strength of the human spirit. Even in the face of loss, people found the courage to keep dreaming, to keep working, and to keep exploring. Chapter 9. The Soviets' Final Push. The space race was heating up. By the late 1960s, the goal was clear: reach the moon. The United States had made steady progress. Their Apollo program was on its way to achieving President Kennedy's dream. But the Soviet Union was not ready to give up. They had their own plans to land on the moon. The world watched as the two superpowers pushed themselves to the limit. The Soviets had already made history. They were the first to send a satellite into space, the first to send a man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit, the first to send a woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space. But landing on the moon was the ultimate prize. It would prove which country was the leader in space exploration. To win, the Soviets needed a powerful rocket. Their engineers designed the N-1. It was enormous, one of the most ambitious rockets ever built. It had over 30 engines in its first stage. The N-1 was meant to carry cosmonauts to the moon and bring them back safely. But building such a rocket was not easy. The first problem was secrecy. The Soviet government did not want the world to know about their plans. This made it hard to share ideas or learn from mistakes. While NASA shared its successes and failures with the public, the Soviets kept everything hidden. Even many engineers working on the project didn't know the full plan. The N-1 was powerful, but unreliable. The first test launch was in February 1969. Engineers held their breath as the rocket prepared to take off. The engines roared to life, and the N-1 lifted off the ground. But just 69 seconds into the flight, disaster struck. The engines failed, and the rocket crashed back to Earth. The explosion destroyed the launch site. The engineers did not give up. They worked day and night to fix the problems. They tested new designs and made changes. But time was running out. NASA was moving closer to landing on the moon. The Soviets had to act fast. In July 1969, the Americans launched Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were on their way to the moon. The Soviets knew they couldn't beat them, but they still wanted to show they were strong. They sent an unmanned spacecraft, Luna 15, to the moon at the same time. Luna 15's mission was to collect moon rocks and return them to Earth. The race was dramatic. As Apollo 11 prepared to land, Luna 15 was also orbiting the moon. For a moment, it seemed like the Soviets might still make history. But Luna 15 crashed into the lunar surface. It was another setback for the Soviet program. The failure of Luna 15 didn't stop the Soviets. They continued to work on the N-1 rocket. They tried 3 more test launches. Each one ended in failure. The most spectacular was in July 1969, just weeks after Apollo 11's success. The rocket exploded seconds after liftoff, creating a massive fireball. Engineers were devastated. The dream of landing on the moon was slipping away. The Soviet program faced many challenges. The secrecy made it hard to solve problems. The pressure to succeed quickly led to rushed decisions, and the N-1 rocket was simply too complex. It was a brilliant idea, but it didn't work. By 1974, the Soviet Union officially canceled its moon program. The failures of the N-1 rocket were too great to overcome. The dream of landing cosmonauts on the moon was over. The Americans had won the space race. But the Soviets' efforts were not wasted. They achieved many incredible things. They sent the first spacecraft to Mars. They built space stations like Salyut and later Mir. They continued to explore space in other ways. Their setbacks with the moon program only made them more determined to succeed in the future. The engineers and cosmonauts who worked on the moon program were proud of their efforts. They knew they had given everything they could. One of the lead engineers said, "Even in failure, we learned. That is the spirit of exploration." The end of the moon program was a turning point for the Soviet Union. It marked the end of the most intense period of the space race. But it also showed the world how much humans could achieve when they dared to dream big. The space race had pushed both nations to their limits. It had brought new technologies, new ideas, and new possibilities. Satellites improved communication on Earth. Spacecraft taught us about the planets and stars. And for the first time, humans saw the Earth from space. They realized how small and precious it was. The Soviets' journey to the moon was filled with challenges, triumphs, and failures. It reminded the world that exploration is never easy, but it is always worth it. Even in defeat, their efforts inspired others to keep reaching for the stars. As the space race slowed, the United States and the Soviet Union began to work together. In 1975, an American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit. The astronauts and cosmonauts shook hands in space. It was a symbol of hope and cooperation. The Soviets may not have landed on the moon, but their contributions to space exploration were immense. Their courage, determination, and innovation helped humanity take its first steps into the universe. The N-1 rocket, though it never succeeded, was a testament to their ambition. The dream of reaching the moon was shared by both nations. And while only one flag stands there today, the journey was a victory for all of humanity. The Soviets' final push showed that even in failure, there is progress, and even in loss, there is inspiration. Chapter 10. The Eagle Has Landed. The date was July 20th, 1969. The world was watching. In homes, schools, and public squares, millions of people stared at their televisions. They were waiting for history to be made. the Apollo 11 mission had reached the moon. The spacecraft carried 3 astronauts. Neil Armstrong was the commander. Buzz Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. Michael Collins was the command module pilot. Together, they had traveled over 240,000 miles from Earth to the moon. The journey began 4 days earlier. On July 16th, the Saturn V rocket had launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The ground shook as the massive rocket roared to life. Flames and smoke filled the air. Slowly, it rose into the sky, carrying the hopes and dreams of humanity. Inside the spacecraft, the astronauts felt the incredible force of liftoff. Their training kept them calm. They had prepared for this moment for years. Each step of the mission had been carefully planned. But there were still dangers. Anything could go wrong. After leaving Earth's orbit, Apollo 11 began its journey to the moon. The spacecraft had 3 parts: the command module, the service module, and the lunar module. Michael Collins stayed in the command module, orbiting the moon. Neil and Buzz would take the lunar module, called Eagle, down to the surface. As Eagle approached the moon, tension filled the air. The astronauts had to find a safe place to land. The surface was rocky, with craters and boulders. Neil Armstrong took manual control of the spacecraft. He guided it carefully, searching for a flat area. Fuel was running low. The ground crew in Houston held their breath. The clock was ticking. Finally, Neil's voice came through the radio. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Cheers erupted in mission control. Around the world, people celebrated, but the mission was not over yet. Neil and Buzz still had to step outside. The world waited anxiously for the next moment. Hours later, Neil Armstrong prepared to leave the lunar module. He wore a bulky spacesuit and a helmet. Every movement was slow and careful. He opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder. At the bottom, he paused. His next step would make history. Neil placed his foot on the lunar surface. It was covered in fine dust, like powder. He said the words that would be remembered forever. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The world watched in awe. For the first time, a human stood on another world. People cheered. Some cried. It was a moment of wonder and hope. It showed what humans could achieve when they worked together. Buzz Aldrin joined Neil on the surface. He described the scene as magnificent desolation. The sky was black, but the surface was bright under the sun. The 2 astronauts moved carefully. The moon's gravity was weaker than Earth's, making them feel light. They practiced walking and jumping to stay balanced. Neil and Buzz set up experiments on the moon. They placed a device to measure moonquakes. They collected rock and soil samples to bring back to Earth. They also planted the American flag. It stood proudly on the lunar surface, a symbol of achievement. The astronauts spoke to President Richard Nixon from the moon. "For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives," Nixon said. "Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world." Neil and Buzz spent over 2 hours on the surface. They took photos and explored the area. But they had to be careful. Their time was limited. The lunar module had to lift off and rejoin Michael Collins in the command module. Returning to the lunar module was tricky. The astronauts had to climb back up the ladder and seal the hatch. Then, the Eagle lifted off, leaving behind part of the module. It rose into the black sky, carrying Neil and Buzz back to the orbiting spacecraft. Michael Collins was waiting in the command module. He had been alone, orbiting the moon, while Neil and Buzz explored. He later said he felt like the most lonely person in the universe. But he was also proud to be part of the mission. The 3 astronauts reunited in the command module. Together, they began their journey back to Earth. The crew of Apollo 11 had achieved the impossible. They had reached the moon and returned safely. On July 24th, the command module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. Rescue teams were waiting. The astronauts were brought aboard a ship where they were welcomed as heroes. Around the world, people celebrated their success. The Apollo 11 mission was more than a victory for the United States. It was a victory for humanity. It showed that humans could explore beyond their planet. It inspired millions to dream big and reach for the stars. Neil, Buzz, and Michael became symbols of courage and determination. They reminded the world that exploration is worth the risks. They proved that with teamwork and perseverance, anything is possible. The words, "The Eagle has landed," became a symbol of hope and achievement. They marked the moment when humanity took its first steps into the universe. The Apollo 11 mission changed history. It showed us that we are capable of greatness. As Neil Armstrong once said, exploration is about pushing the limits of what we know. It's about going where we have never gone before. Apollo 11 was just the beginning. The stars were waiting. Chapter 11. A New Age of Discovery. The space race had changed the world. It began as a competition between 2 powerful nations. The United States and the Soviet Union worked hard to outdo each other. They sent satellites, animals, and people into space. They reached the moon. But by the 1970s, the race began to slow. Both nations faced new challenges. Building rockets and spacecraft was expensive. People started asking if the money could be better spent on problems here on Earth. The Cold War tensions softened slightly. The fierce competition of the space race began to shift. It was no longer just about being first. It became about exploring space for all of humanity. The lessons of the space race had lasting effects. Satellites were one of the greatest achievements. They made life on Earth better. They improved communication, allowing people to talk to each other across long distances. Weather satellites helped predict storms. Others were used for navigation and television signals. Life on Earth was changing because of what had been learned in space. New projects were also beginning. NASA built the first American space station, called Skylab. Skylab was launched in 1973. It allowed astronauts to live and work in space for weeks at a time. They studied how space affected the human body. They learned how to grow food in space. Skylab taught scientists how to live and work far from Earth. The Soviet Union also built space stations. Their first was called Salyut. Later, they created a more advanced station called Mir. Mir became a symbol of Soviet skill in space exploration. It stayed in orbit for many years, hosting cosmonauts and even international crews. The lessons from Skylab and Mir helped prepare for future missions to the moon and beyond. As the space race slowed, something remarkable happened. The two rival nations began to work together. In 1975, a mission called Apollo-Soyuz showed the world that cooperation was possible. An American spacecraft, Apollo, and a Soviet spacecraft, Soyuz, were launched into space. Their mission was to meet in orbit and dock together. This moment was historic. The two crews greeted each other in space. They exchanged gifts and shared meals. American astronaut Thomas Stafford and Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov shook hands in the weightlessness of space. The handshake was broadcast around the world. It became a symbol of peace and partnership. Apollo-Soyuz showed that space exploration could bring people together. It marked the beginning of a new era. Scientists and engineers realized that cooperation was better than competition. By working together, they could achieve more. The spirit of Apollo-Soyuz continued in future projects. In the 1990s, countries around the world worked together to build the International Space Station, ISS. The ISS became a place for scientists to study space and perform experiments. Astronauts from many nations lived and worked there. It showed what humans could achieve when they united. Beyond the space stations, new missions were being planned. Scientists wanted to explore other planets. The Soviet Union sent probes to Venus. They studied its thick, hot atmosphere and rocky surface. NASA sent spacecraft to Mars. The Viking missions in the 1970s took pictures of the red planet and searched for signs of life. In 1977, NASA launched the Voyager spacecraft. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 were sent to explore the outer planets. They flew past Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, sending back incredible pictures and data. Voyager 1 eventually left the solar system, carrying a golden record with sounds and images of life on Earth. It became humanity's message to the stars. The dream of space exploration grew. People imagined missions to other worlds, space tourism, and colonies on the moon or Mars. The space race had inspired generations to dream big. It showed that humans could overcome challenges and reach for the stars. But space exploration also reminded people of their shared humanity. From space, astronauts saw the Earth as a small, fragile planet. It had no borders, no divisions. It was just a beautiful blue and green sphere floating in the darkness. This view changed how people thought about the world. It inspired movements to protect the environment and work for peace. The Apollo-Soyuz handshake in space was more than just a meeting. It was a promise to the future. It showed that space exploration could unite people. It wasn't just about two nations competing. It was about humanity's journey to understand the universe. Today, the legacy of the space race lives on. Rockets launch satellites into orbit every day. Space stations continue to orbit the Earth. New missions are planned to explore Mars, asteroids, and distant stars. Space agencies from many countries work together, sharing knowledge and ideas. The space race began as a competition, but it became a collaboration. It showed that humans are capable of incredible things. By working together, we can achieve even more. The lessons learned in space continue to shape our future. The age of discovery is not over. It has just begun. Chapter 12. The Legacy of the Stars. The space race was more than a contest between nations. It was a story of courage, ambition, and discovery. It showed the world what humans could achieve when they dared to dream. The journey to the stars changed everything. Before the space race, space was just a mystery. People looked up at the night sky and wondered. They wrote stories about gods, monsters, and other worlds. But the idea of traveling to space seemed impossible. The space race turned that dream into reality. The early days of the space race were full of excitement and tension. The Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik. Then came Yuri Gagarin, the first human to orbit the Earth. America responded with Alan Shepard and John Glenn. Each mission brought new challenges and new victories. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, it was a moment of triumph. People everywhere felt proud and inspired. The words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," reminded the world that space exploration was for everyone. But the space race wasn't just about astronauts. Scientists and engineers worked behind the scenes, solving problems and building machines that had never existed before. They developed powerful rockets, precise computers, and life support systems. These inventions didn't just help astronauts, they changed life on Earth too. Satellites, one of the greatest achievements of the space race, improved communication. They made it possible to talk to people on the other side of the world. They helped predict the weather, navigate planes and ships, and even broadcast live television. The world became more connected because of space. The space race also taught humanity about the universe. Telescopes and probes revealed new details about the moon, planets, and stars. Spacecraft like Voyager and Hubble opened our eyes to the beauty and vastness of space. They showed us that our planet is just a tiny part of something much bigger. Astronauts became heroes. They risked their lives to explore the unknown. People admired their bravery and determination. Yuri Gagarin, John Glenn, Valentina Tereshkova, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and many others became symbols of human potential. they inspired a new generation to dream of exploring space. The space race also had challenges and tragedies. The Apollo 1 fire and the loss of Challenger and Columbia reminded the world that space exploration is dangerous. But even in the face of these tragedies, people kept moving forward. They knew that the risks were worth it. Exploration always comes with challenges, but it also brings great rewards. When the space race ended, the journey to the stars continued. The United States and the Soviet Union, later Russia, began working together. The International Space Station, ISS, became a symbol of global cooperation. Astronauts from many countries lived and worked there, performing experiments and learning how to live in space for long periods. The legacy of the space race lives on. New missions are being planned. Robots are exploring Mars, searching for signs of life. Powerful telescopes are looking deeper into the universe, studying distant galaxies and black holes. Spacecraft are visiting asteroids and moons, collecting samples and sending back data. Private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin are joining the effort. They are building rockets, planning missions, and dreaming of space tourism. They want to make space accessible to everyone. The dream of going to space is no longer limited to governments. It belongs to all of humanity. The space race also changed how people see the Earth. From space, astronauts saw our planet as a small, fragile sphere surrounded by darkness. It had no borders, no divisions, just land, water, and clouds. This view reminded people that we share one home. It inspired efforts to protect the environment and work for peace. The journey to space is not over. There are still many mysteries to solve. What lies beneath the surface of Mars? Could there be life on Europa, one of Jupiter's moons? How far can humans travel into the universe? These questions drive scientists, engineers, and dreamers to keep exploring. The stars still call to us. They remind us of our place in the universe. They inspire us to look up and wonder. The space race may have ended, but the journey beyond the stars has only just begun. In the words of Carl Sagan, a famous scientist, somewhere something incredible is waiting to be known. The legacy of the space race is not just in the rockets and spacecraft. It is in the spirit of discovery. It is in the courage to ask questions and seek answers. The story of the space race is a story of humanity. It shows what we can achieve when we work together. It teaches us to dream big, to take risks, and to never stop exploring. The stars are not just out of reach. They are our destination. As we continue the journey, we carry the lessons of the past, the courage of the astronauts, the creativity of the engineers, the determination of the scientists. These are the things that will take us to the next frontier. The legacy of the stars is a reminder of what we can accomplish. It is a call to action. The universe is vast and full of wonders. The journey to explore it belongs to all of us, and it is far from over.